Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that will have you coming back for more. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So before we get to our main event, just a reminder for those who are on YouTube, please hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. Also, we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other streaming platforms. Make sure you subscribe there as well. Now, for those who would like to make a monetary contribution to help us build this platform, you can do it with 4 different venues. So the first venue, of course, is Patreon for those who have been day ones and you know what Identity Talk's all about. You could become a patron today so you can get exclusive perks and get behind the scenes footage on all things Identity Talk. So if you want to get that extra perk and learn more about what we do, make sure you become a patron today. And then for those who want to do one-time donations, you're still getting a feel for what we do here on this podcast. There are 3 places where you can go. The first is Cash App, using our handle, $IDTALK4ED. If you are using Venmo, you could use the handle @KwameSM. And then through PayPal, you can use the URL paypal.me/KwameSM. And to catch new and past episodes of our podcast, you can always go to our main website at IDTALK4educators.com. And then, of course, in a little over a month away, my new book will be coming out, Learn to Relearn, Supporting Identity in a Culturally Affirming Classroom. This is a book that I'm just elated for it to come out. So many years, 3 years of writing, and so many people contributed to getting this book to the finish line, from the publishers, Stenhouse and Routledge, to the 50 plus people who interviewed for this book, the illustrators, the production team. It was such a collaborative effort. I just can't take full credit for the book being what it is today. And I'm so happy that it's going to finally be in the hands of readers on November 15th. So if you haven't pre-ordered your copy today, make sure you go on Amazon to put in that pre-order. We go international too. So even if you're in the UK, you in other parts of Europe, you're in Africa, US, of course, the Americas, you can get it anywhere where you are. So make sure you do that. You could also go to the book's main website, learningtorelearn.com, to learn more about the chapters and get access to some free learner resources to help you with your journey. And that's all I got for now. More to come in future episodes. All right, y'all. So now that we got that out the way, let's get to today's guest. She is somebody who I've had a chance to follow on LinkedIn, on Twitter for a while, and I just love the work she does. I love her vulnerability. I love the fact that she is telling her story in such an open way that allows for others to come in and to get a sense of who she is and who she's evolving into. Because when we do anything identity-based, it requires introspection. It requires us to really dig deep and tap into those life experiences where we're still trying to figure out who we are, but also make sense of things that have happened to us. So I'm excited to have today's guest come on to talk with us about her journey as an educator, as a human, as a mother, and really learn about who she is. So without further ado, I want to bring on Bennie Kara to the podcast to talk with us about her journey. So let's bring Bennie on. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for that introduction. That was really lovely.
I appreciate that. Thank you for coming on and talking with us. How you feeling today?
I'm good. I'm good. It's interesting that you talk about introspection. I do find myself to be an introspective person, but I think you're right. You know, this work particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion, requires looking at oneself. So I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah, and I think we have quite a bit in common. There's some parallels here. So I know in your case, we do have African connection. 'Cause I know your parents, they were migrants
Yeah.
out in East Africa. So I don't know what part. Kenya, I'm assuming.
Yeah. Kenya and Uganda. Yeah.
Uganda, yep, right around there. A
Yeah.
lot
Yeah.
of Indians
Absolutely.
out there. So I know there's that. My parents being from Ghana.
Yeah.
But before we get to all the education stuff, let's talk about that early upbringing, because I believe that's played a major role and has shaped a lot of who you are. So I'd love to give you the floor to do that.
Yeah, so I'm the child of East African Asian migrants. It's really hard to know what to call them. My father, I suppose, was a refugee from Uganda. My mother was more of a migrant in a time of trouble in Kenya. And they arrived here in the UK in the 1970s, and it was really tricky for them, and growing up as somebody who was born in the UK, knowing their history, and feeling a little adrift. Actually, this idea of where is home was always a big question of mine. Feeling like I ought to be British, but I wasn't quite British, but that I wasn't African, for obvious reasons, and that we were part of a colonial movement in East Africa, but also not really feeling particularly Indian in the sense of that I had very little connection, 2 generations before me born in Africa. And so a really kind of mix of places I could claim but couldn't. And for me, I spent a long time thinking about how I fit into this world, and still do to a certain extent. But yeah, born and raised in the UK, just spent a long time wondering what that meant for me as an individual, as a teacher, as a mother. So yeah, a long process of thinking.
And whereabouts in the UK, for those
So
who may not know?
I was born in the Midlands. One of the quirks of the expulsion of Asians from East Africa was that they were funneled into different places in the UK. My mother ended up in London. My father ended up in Leicester. Leicester at the time was a hostile space. There were adverts in the paper saying, "Don't come here." And there was a real sense of a kind of influx of immigrants taking over a space. And what my family did was really set roots down in Leicester. They opened a business. They were involved in the gold trade. My father was a jeweler, and they ran that business for a very, very long time until the gold trade really collapsed in the UK. And the Midlands is a real melting pot. I would say one of the most multicultural places in the UK, but it certainly was very hostile when they arrived. But it's turned out to be quite a success story when it comes to the settling of migrants into an area.
So, of course, as I was doing my research on you, I actually had a chance to read a few of your entries in your blog,
Yeah,
The Unlearning, which is very fitting because I'm all about
yeah.
unlearning myself. And you really were really vulnerable about some of the things that have happened, even going back to your childhood.
Mm.
And that leads me to my next question, which is thinking about your experience in school, primary, secondary level. What were some of those challenges or struggles that you had as far as embracing who you were fully in that space and even beyond that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's true to say that I didn't embrace my full authentic self. I grew up at a time when, the idea of being British and integrating and assimilating was seen as the right thing to do by my community, but also those outside of my community. And so the aim for me throughout school and throughout my childhood was to be as white as I could be, knowing actually that that was just impossible. And I've often spoken about the books that I read as a child. As much as the publishing industry has moved on now, really back in the 80s and 90s, we had very few protagonists of color. And so I devoured books. I was an avid reader from a really young age. And I found myself trying to identify with characters who were incredibly white, white skin, red hair, blonde hair, blue eyes. And I wanted to be them. And in doing so, really displaced a kind of appreciation for my own skin tone, for my own heritage, for my own features. And I call it now a kind of real sense of developing internalized racism that, for me, being Asian was not seen as a positive. And I lived in a very monocultural society in that everybody around us, particularly at school, was East African Asian. So it wasn't that I was a fish out of water, but I did reject elements of my culture to try and be what I deemed at the time, and I hate myself for this now, better than them. And I think that's the immigrant experience as well. You try and rise out of the ashes of your parents' life, and for me that meant trying to be something that I could never really be. And of course, the whole curriculum itself just didn't have any kind of reference to me, my heritage, my culture. I didn't know anything about what it meant to be Asian. I didn't know anything about Africa beyond that of the charity campaigns of the 80s. And now I feel a little bit robbed by that, because it felt like there was this hidden body of knowledge somebody said wasn't worthy for me to know. So I really did struggle to embrace my full authentic self. It's only as an adult that I've really tried to do that more.
I know with some parents, when they recognize that their children are struggling in that way, they find ways to counteract it at home, whether it's telling stories about how it was for them growing up back in the home country, or they
Yeah.
expose you to other parts of the culture. So I'm wondering if your parents ever had those conversations around identity, particularly around what it was like to live in Kenya, Indian heritage, things like that.
Yeah, in that we were culturally Hindu, in that, we celebrated Hindu festivals. My parents weren't particularly strict in terms of their observance. They did want me to go to temple. They did want me to celebrate, religious holidays. I just didn't have a clue about what they meant. I was more familiar with Christian holidays than Hindu holidays.
Mhm.
But in saying that, I grew up in a household of storytellers. My family would recount some stories of times in Africa. So my mother would tell me stories of, being on a train from Nairobi to Mombasa, for example, and how beautiful it was, and the heat and the areas that they lived. So I had some sense of it, but didn't really have the full story, because they were reluctant to talk about it, because they felt very burned by the whole situation. A place that they felt was home, they were essentially told, you can't stay here. And so as much as I had that, there was no kind of formalized nature of that. And the counteracting, I really rejected. My family said, learn to speak your home language. And I said, no, it wasn't, I didn't see it as the language of progression, of business, of commerce, anything. I said I wanted to learn French instead, and I did.
Oh, so tu parles français?
Un peu.
Okay. Yeah, same here.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm on my Duolingo journey right now.
Ah,
So I got a 76-day streak right now.
I love
So
that. That's
yeah,
good.
I'm building on that. I'm building on that. Trying to refresh on it. But yeah, I think that's something that our parents, they have this thought when they first come into the new country as immigrants. I know for my parents, they had their struggles trying to find work. And the mindset at that time, particularly in the 70s, was English was the language of progression. If you were fluent in English, then guess what? That's what's going to advance you
Mm,
professionally and personally. And that's what's going to serve as a shield of protection
mm.
when it comes to some of the isms.
Yeah.
And my parents spoke fluent English when they got to
Mm,
the States. I mean, when you come from a West African country like Ghana that was
mm,
colonized by Great Britain, you're gonna
mm.
speak some pretty good English.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that's within the school system. But that still didn't change some of the trials and tribulations they had when they got there. So, in thinking about your journey and eventually becoming a teacher, what was that moment where you said, all right, we need to find some books where we have some black and brown protagonists? I've
Oh my
seen
goodness.
white faces all my life in these books. I need to see some faces who look like me.
I'm going to be honest. I was 19 when I first read a book by a brown author. I
Wow.
was at university. And that wasn't me choosing, it was a module that I'd picked, not deliberately. It was a post-colonial literature model. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I'll have a look. And it only really occurred to me later, actually, not even in the moment, that was the first time. Up until that time, the act of writing was the preserve of Western Europe. And people with white skin. And you are so in it as a student, as somebody who is just going out into the world of work, that you don't even recognize the fact that there's something missing, that representation matters.
Mhm.
And it was when I read Rushdie, I read Arundhati Roy, I read Anita Desai, and realized that people were talking about me and my heritage and people who looked like me. And it was a very strange sensation in that I had to reconcile my understanding of who I was with what I was seeing in text, and to get the full range of human experience in books that were written by Black and brown authors was a surprise. I found myself thinking, is this me? Is this who I am? Which bits of this can I claim? And in some ways, I found it quite alien in itself, because I'd grown up not reading that. And this was before I became a teacher. And I think even in my early teaching years, I didn't recognize the importance of that identity aspect of our work, because you're so consumed with behavior management and delivering the syllabus, and you don't question what's in it. So it was only really probably about 6 or 7 years ago, so what, 15 years into my career, that I really started to reflect on why it was important.
And I think it was during that time, I mean, you were holding the deputy headship position. So you're like in administrative level. So you're overseeing staff,
Yeah.
you're overseeing students. And that's around the time where you start to have those epiphanies of, oh, you know what? I need to consider these different identity markers in this work.
Yeah. And it was surrounding myself with people who were having that conversation that really triggered my thought processes. I met some wonderful human beings, one of whom is Hannah Wilson, who I worked with at a school. And for the first time, we were considering what to put in. It was a startup school, it was a brand new school. We were considering what that curriculum could look like. And it was very much a case of, well, we don't have to do it as we've always done it. And I'm ashamed to say, the first iteration of that curriculum, particularly as an English teacher, was also very Eurocentric, to the point where the students noticed. They knew me as a feminist. They knew me as somebody who was interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the students actually said, Miss Kara, why is your curriculum so white? If this is what you're interested in, white and male. And I thought, oh, I've just
Wow.
replicated everything that I've learned, thinking this is what Matthew Arnold calls the best of what's been thought and said, and didn't recognize that I was just perpetuating a cycle. And that's when it started to change. So yeah, and I had influence over what was being taught at that point, and was able to steer a little bit. And it was early ideas, and since then, I've kind of developed a much more complex understanding of what a curriculum should be for young people. But yeah, certainly it took a long time. These patterns are hard to unpick. They're hard to unlearn.
So, in speaking about that, I know you have your recent book, The Diverse Curriculum, where you talk about this very issue. So, as you were going through that writing process, I'm wondering how much of that unlearning had to take place as you were writing this book.
I mean, so much. I had already formulated some thoughts about what was missing. I looked back at my own education and in the 6 schools that I'd worked in 20 years of teaching, and was able to identify some patterns. And I'm a big fan of spotting patterns in things, and was able to see where the gaps were. And I was questioning how those gaps had come about. And I came across the work of decolonial thinkers who really challenged my understanding of what knowledge and valued knowledge was. You know, the idea of valued knowledge became a central part of this book because certainly through the colonial endeavour, the idea of knowledge itself has been affected by categorizations on race, you know, perceptions of the East, perceptions of Africa and Africans. And the erasure suddenly became really apparent that what we teach our young people has been the preserve of white Western Europe for so long, not just as an accident of geography, but as a broader a broader issue when it comes to who we see as valid in terms of writers or scientists or mathematicians or astronomers. And I had to learn, you know, who those people were, you know, who are the great Middle Eastern cartographers. How has Africa contributed to the world of science? And actually, that was the best bit. I got to research so much in terms of the missing knowledge. You know, I loved finding out about the Dogon people of Mali. I loved finding out about the Ishango bone. I loved finding out about Muhammad al-Idrisi in the Middle East and the Rani of Jhansi in India, because none of these stories had come to me as a child. I had to go through the process of recognizing what I hadn't been taught and going out and finding it. And it wasn't that hard. You know, this information exists. So it's not some esoteric stuff that, you know, is buried. It's there. We just don't look for it very often.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. It's even more accessible now with all the technology that exists. But you mentioned Hannah earlier. So Hannah was on this very platform the previous week sharing her story. So shout out to Hannah. And she told me a little bit about how you all form diverse educators. So we're not going to get into the full story because people can watch that previous episode. But I am interested in knowing, as you were doing your unlearning, at what point did it come to a head where you're in this deputy headship and you're going through the system, but you're also in conflict with your principles as it pertains to curriculum development, as it pertains to how students should learn, how there should be more of a focus on identity, DEIB. When did you decide, you know what, I got to be brave. I got to jump out of this system and just dive into this work that I'm doing with diverse educators and consult?
It was a tough decision because I love teaching. You know, I didn't leave teaching because I was disillusioned. I didn't leave teaching because I hated it. I recognized that I'd given 20 of the, you know, really decent years of my life to a job that I absolutely adored. But what was becoming increasingly apparent when I started Diverse Educators with Hannah was that there was such a lack of knowledge around DEIB. There was such a lack of knowledge in terms of curriculum development and diversity in the curriculum. And so I tried to balance the two. I worked part-time as a deputy head, which is unusual. And then I went on to, you know, take up my evenings and weekends, going to conferences, delivering training. and realized I couldn't do both, and that if I'd always wanted to have an impact on the system on a big scale, and for me that had always meant perhaps being the head of a school, and I recognized that actually being the head of one school is important and an incredible privilege and responsibility, but I was talking to teachers across the country, and I couldn't do that if I was the head of a school. So there was really a decision to make about which way to go. It's terrifying going from this very regulated, regimented life with timetables and, a curriculum to follow, to generating your own income and persuading people that what you're talking about is valid. But the decision was ultimately moved on by the fact that my partner and I decided to adopt 2 little girls. And when we looked at our lives as educators, when my partner's an educator too, realized actually that I could do the work around consultancy, fulfill the mission, if you like, but also have time to spend time with my children, who had already had so much trauma in their lives. And so it became a bit of an easy decision in that sense, because being a mum was something that I always wanted, but I knew that I could have more influence doing that and being a full-time consultant. And people don't like the C word, the consultancy word. I don't know really what my job title is these days. I train, I speak, I write, I consult, whatever that person is, multi-portfolio.
Yeah, and with regard to the conferences, Hannah told me a story about you again, where she said when you all first started DE, she'd be able to go to this conference, and then she literally said, in your case, Benny had to break herself into 4 pieces just to attend all these different conferences.
Yeah.
And that's when she really started to be more mindful about the importance of intersectionality, the importance of making sure that we are accounting for all the different identity markers. So with that, I wanted to know, with the work that you do as a writer, as a consultant, as a speaker, how are you seeing those 3 P's, privilege, positionality, and power? How are you seeing those 3 P's influence the work that you do in those different capacities?
I mean, intersectionality, I think, is often seen by people, often wrongly, as a series of barriers. And yes, there are barriers to having a very intersectional identity. You face unique barriers in that sense. But I recognize my privilege in sitting at some of those intersections, as a woman who is Asian in a same-sex relationship who has a disability. I know that my lenses allow me to see human experience differently, more broadly. I often would go to these conferences and think about the interests of women, or the interests of people who are the global majority, or the interests of people who are LGBT, and recognize that there are so many parallels, but nobody was talking to each other. And solidarity is about recognizing not just your own path, but the pathways of others and the barriers that others face. And so in that sense, I think I really took on the power of having those different identities. And my positionality in all of this was not to be a spokesperson for all of them, but to facilitate conversation about what it meant to be a woman and Asian, what it meant to be Asian and gay, and what it meant to have a disability, an invisible disability. And so, I do think that, as much as some people will say, oh, you're using this card and that card and that card, all of those cards make me knowledgeable, and make me empathetic. And I've often talked about how privileged I feel to be able to see the world that way. That my lenses allow me to see the world in its entirety. And of course, there are things that I don't know and I've had to learn about. But again, that sense of empathy and that sense of, well, if I'm experiencing this, how does somebody with this identity experience it, or this disability experience it? And that level of kind of looking outside of yourself, I think, and I'm really grateful that I can do that. And so my identity has really shaped that curiosity I have, I think, around people around me.
And I would imagine that doing this work that we do has allowed you to have a better understanding of yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And and I think that's why I've reached the level of introspection that I have, where I've been writing these Substack blogs, because it's only now recognizing all of those parts of myself that I look back and think about the injustice of my childhood, and how pigeonholed I was by, I think, predominantly being seen as Asian and nothing else. And being able to unpick some of that now means that I am far more aware of all of the different puzzle pieces that make up who I am, and allows me to celebrate them, which I don't think I did in the past. And that's what I want for young people, not to wait till they're in their 40s like me to be able to celebrate themselves. Like, surely they are entitled as children to know how wonderful they are and how unique they are, and how much they've contributed to the fabric of our everyday life. That shouldn't be something you wait for.
And I know you and your partner, you have children,
Yeah,
so you are a mother.
yeah.
So I'd love for you to just talk about how this work you've been doing with yourself has translated into your parenting. And more specifically, how do you build that confidence in your children so that they're able to own their stories, knowing the world that we live in?
Mm. It's really tricky, and one of the things that we went through with adoption was the question about interracial adoption. My partner is white, I am Asian, and when we were being asked, what kind of child would we like, we were very clear that it didn't matter to us. We understood the challenges of cross-racial adoption. We also recognized, which children were available, but also found real barriers in selecting children. Quite often it would be, this child requires a family that is white, or this requires a family that requires, black parents. And we didn't fit into those categories neatly, with being two women as well. So eventually, we were matched with two little girls who were white and black African. And the immediate thing that I realized was the lack of specificity about what kind of black my children's heritage held. So, I asked questions about whether my children had Caribbean heritage or African heritage. And, I knew that they were white British, 3/4 white British, but I didn't know anything else. So that was a real gap in our understanding of who they are. And we made a decision very early on about, always talking about their identity and their skin color. We started talking about the difference between my skin and my youngest skin, who's very, very fair, and my eldest. They're 4 and 3 at the moment. But we talk about skin tone and brown like me, or mixed, or biracial. We haven't used the word biracial yet. Mixed like my eldest. And she is able to really identify who looks like her and who doesn't look like her without any prejudice. But we've also talked about what a hijab is, and we've talked about disability and why somebody might use a wheelchair. And so all of the work that I've done is kind of now being channeled into them always understanding who they are. I'm worried about the questions about their heritage because we have so little information. So we've decided to think about Africa and the spaces within, and expose them to literature that demonstrates different skin tones and different heritages, so that they are familiar with that from the outset. And we are lucky to live in a time now where that is more possible, because that wasn't necessarily possible when I was a child. But, for me, they will always know what their heritage is, but they will always be global citizens. And I think that, to me, as a mother, it becomes really important. How do they fit in the society that they're in? They don't just fit because they were born here. They fit because actually in the history of the world, they are part of the story. So for me, it's about giving them a gift, I think, that I didn't have.
And it's great that you are taking a proactive approach to this, because it's hard to know when the best time is to have those conversations. I don't think there is a best time. I think it's one of those things where you focus more on identity affirmation,
Mm,
just getting them to feel good about who they are.
yeah.
And then when they do come across some of the issues that we know are going to come, then I guess you have those conversations at that particular time.
Mm.
And then I'm also thinking about the fact that you have a very unique family structure.
Mm.
And in my case, it's more on the conventional end where I have a wife,
Yeah.
I have two sons. They know
Yes.
that their father comes from Ghana. They know that their mother has Panamanian and a Bayesian heritage.
Yeah.
They know where it traces back to. But yet I'm still scared about having the conversations. There's still times where my wife and I are not even sure of what to say,
Yeah.
especially now given the social political climate that we find ourselves in, not
Mm.
just in the States, but even in the UK. There's a lot
Absolutely.
that's been going on. Like,
Yeah.
how do you have those conversations with them?
Yeah. And it's something that, we know that we're going to have to do.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're conscious of is the adultification of Black children. The fact that they are seen as more culpable, more scheming, for want of a better word, all based in this kind of very deep-seated racism. Do I think it's the right time now to talk to them about that? No. I want them to grow up in a world trusting, but I also want at some point to step in and say, and this is a reality, and we will deal with that together. That's not something you have to deal with on your own. But, and I recognize that even in that, I have privilege and that they have privilege, because certainly my youngest could pass for white, and actually she's not. And, I'm imagining raising young Black men is 10 times harder. And, I think about your position. Yes, you have the conventionality, but you also have that dimension that we don't. They are girls, they are mixed race, they're very light skinned, and colorism plays a huge part in all of this as well. So
Yes.
for them at school, I'm very conscious about school. So if we've had very few behavior related incidents, if anything, they've been the ones on the receiving end. But I know that I am cautious about a teacher saying my child is at fault. I want to know why that is. Is that immediately her? And I would always support schools, but I also know what the reality is. There's this study done years ago by a researcher called Gilliam. It was a study in the States, actually, who took 135 educators and
Yes.
put them on a computer and said, press when there's any potential of misbehavior for these preschoolers. And the results corresponded with exclusion rates in the States for young Black men. And there was no actual misbehavior. So being conscious of some of the research around this means that I am more conscious for my children, even though I know they have relative privilege.
Yeah, because the biases that some teachers hold when they enter the classroom. We
Yeah,
all have them. I
yeah,
know I did when I
yeah.
was still in the classroom. So we have to be able to confront them
Mm,
and be
yeah.
honest about that.
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about unconscious bias with teachers, because I think that when somebody hears that they have bias, they feel it's an accusation, that it's a deliberate act on the same level as punching somebody in the face. And as much as it has serious consequences, they've got to recognize that our brains work in a particular way, and they are conditioned by the society that we live in. And so it's not about blame, it's about recognition,
Hmm.
recognizing the ways our brain works. They are intrinsically flawed. And the work of Dr. Jennifer Aberhart, I think, is really influential in my thinking, in her book Bias, when it came to kind of educating teachers about this. I obviously believe that teachers are good people. They've dedicated their lives to this profession,
Right.
but we can't change the fact that bias exists, and it does make me cautious as a parent. And yeah, it's just reality, I think.
Yeah. And to start to wrap things up, I want to get the attention back on you. So you do a lot of writing. As we mentioned in the beginning, you are very introspective about your experiences in life. I'm curious, what are some things that you are experiencing right now? What are you still exploring or learning about yourself at this time?
Oh my goodness, I could go on about this all day. You should probably regret asking me this. um Now that I've opened the floodgates, if you like, um I'm going off in different directions. I did a series of blogs on on the body, the perceptions of the body, particularly being an Asian woman, and how we teach young people to accept the bodies that they have, within reason, and how actually we are so subject to the generations before us and their views of what the body should be, what skin tone should be, what size and shape you should be, but also how the beauty industry and media and representations, particularly of global majority people, really influence ideas of what beautiful is. So that's part of what's going on. Particularly now that I have two young girls, how are they going to grow up appreciating their bodies and not trying to adjust them in any way? And more and more, I'm thinking about policy. We're going through a curriculum review in the UK at the moment with our new government, and really thinking about, well, what will it look like, if we had the chance to start again. And I say this as a kind of utopian ideal. What would we do? How would we do it differently? And for me, it's the recognition of the colonial forces on our thinking, about what valued knowledge is. As I said at the start, I want to stand in front of government and say, actually, we've always done it this way because we've always lived in this space. What if we could step out of that space? And one of the big influences on this is the work of Nelson Mandela and Sir Desmond Tutu, in their work in South Africa. I looked at Truth and Reconciliation and the Commission there. How do you move beyond racial division? To any degree, you have to have truth first. So what's the truth about empire? What's the truth about the colonial project? What's the truth about enslavement? If we can get that, because I don't think we're there yet, then maybe we can move towards reconciliation. So these kind of big policy, political ideas are really percolating at the moment. But yes, I so much. I sometimes have to say to myself at 2 a.m, stop. You need some sleep. Go to bed now. You don't need to think this through right now.
Well, I appreciate you for sharing a little bit about that. And my final question is the one that I ask everybody who comes on here.
Yeah.
How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
Oh my goodness. Because I'm one of those people where everything is a teachable moment. So my children get it a lot. It's like, oh, this happened. Well, if you've done this, I recognize that can be highly irritating. But I stay true to the teacher in me by writing. My writing is another way of teaching. It's teaching people who haven't had my world views, my world experiences, what it means to sit inside my skin. And that's often an act of evoking empathy and building those bridges. Part of being a teacher is not just about delivering in the classroom. It's about what you allow other adults to see and learn about yourself. And so I don't think I'll ever stop that. And I don't think I'll ever stop wanting to go back to the classroom. I miss the children. So, they are the reason we do the job. So maybe one day you'll find me back in the room struggling with photocopiers.
Yeah, I don't think I missed that part of the job, but I do get what you're saying. And I think we always want to be around the kids. It's why we love what we do. It's the best part of the job, being in that classroom, having that sanctuary with the students. All the other stuff, honestly, I could do without.
Yeah.
If you just give me that experience,
Yeah.
I could live with that. But Bennie, thank you so much for taking the time to share about your journey. Hopefully, people who aren't familiar with your work have learned a little bit more about who you are, and we'll tap in.
Yeah.
So, to help those people tap in, please let them know how they can connect with you on social media. Also, you could plug in any services you provide individually, because I know you do some workshops through your own consultancy. So please, floor is yours.
So I do spend too much time on social media. I have avoided Twitter/X recently, on a moral standpoint. So I've moved over to Blue Sky. My handle on Blue Sky is still at Bennie Kara. If you type that in, it will come up. I am on LinkedIn as Bennie Kara. and on Instagram as _Bennie Kara _. My work is I co-founded Diverse Educators, and I work for Diverse Educators. But I also have my own consultancy at adharaeducation.com, ADHARA. And I provide training on diversity in the curriculum and curriculum design generally, but also around DEIB generally. I also work on literacy projects. I strongly believe in the power of books. And so, you know, I work with schools on developing cultures of reading, because I genuinely feel that's the way forward. And the book is out. The Diverse Curriculum is out electronically on the 28th of December, and in print on the 11th of January. And I love hearing what people think. So please do get in touch and say, actually, you know, that didn't chime, or yes, that bit did. It's fascinating to keep that as an open conversation.
Yes. And make sure you all tap in with Bennie, connect with her, have some stories with her, and let's continue to move forward together. So, on behalf of Bennie, I thank you all for tuning in to another episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.